For exactly 1 year to the day, beginning on New Year's Eve 1901, Nellie McGowan kept a diary. She was using her diary to investigate a mystery. It's not exactly a mystery of great historical consequence, but it is probably much more relatable than many of the stories we've told anywhere else on this podcast for anyone who has ever been a younger sibling or has ever had a younger sibling. Basically, this big mystery that Nellie McGowan started her diary in an effort to figure out was whether or not her older sister Bessie secretly had a boyfriend. For Nellie McGowan, that was a really exciting deviation from her normal life. But for us, what makes Nellie's diary so fascinating is that her normal everyday life was on Partridge Island, which was a quarantine site for sick passengers of these great immigrant ships arriving in Canada. Nellie McGowan and her whole family worked caring for these sick passengers as they were isolated on that island.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
Tuesday, December 31st, 1901, New Year's Eve. Fred walked over, and thereon hangs the tale. Bessie, of course, did not want me to know. Poor Fred, the fun I have had over the incident I believe happened at the suspension bridge. The secret made it all the more fun for me.
Begins the opening words of Nellie McGowan's diary. She believed that her sister Bessie and her father's assistant Fred kissed on the suspension bridge when they were in St. John to celebrate New Year's Eve. That's what provoked her to start this diary. Nellie herself had stayed at home on New Year's Eve. Instead of catching a boat across the water to the city like Bessie and Fred, she stayed behind on her little island home of Partridge Island. If you're standing on the waterfront of St. John today, you can see the light from Partridge Island Lighthouse where Nellie and Bessie McGowan once lived, circling around and reflecting on the water. For anyone who hasn't been to St. John, I should really emphasize that this little island we're talking about is not far from the city at all. It's very close, it's highly visible, and Nellie would have been able to clearly see what was at the time the third largest city in Canada from her island home. But despite being so close to that city, visiting it would have been super rare for her. That lighthouse, whose light you can still see reflecting today, is still there on Partridge Island, but it's now automated. Back in 1902, though, when Nellie was writing her diary, it was run by her father, Thomas. Today, Partridge Island is empty, except for some dilapidated ruins of several buildings. These include everything from military fortifications through to the ruins of several small hospitals. Back in Nellie's time, 2 of those hospitals were brand new. They were the peak of modern medical technology for the day. They were ready to be home for sick or contagious immigrants arriving on large European ships carrying hundreds or thousands of new immigrants coming to Canada. Nellie's job, and the jobs of her whole family, in one way or the other, was to care for those sick passengers who were quarantined on the island. On January 14th, one of these ships arrived, and she wrote,
These immigrants, 3 families in quarantine, were very interesting. There were some fine singers amongst them, and it was as good as a concert to listen to them. Fred seemed to miss Bessie quite a lot, and though my suspicions were aroused before, I could not help watching them more closely.
Nellie had been born on the mainland, and she spent most of her life, though, on this island. There had only been 8 other children in her school with her, and they were of all ages. They were taught in the same one-room schoolhouse, and most of them were her siblings. The January ship's passengers weren't very sick, and they were released into Canada shortly afterwards. Most of these immigrants headed out west to Canada's then booming prairie provinces. The particular group aboard that ship seemed to have been Jewish refugees escaping persecution in Russia. In early February, another ship arrived, this time carrying significantly more sick people aboard.
Another storm is brewing, and the first word on Sunday is a steamer is outside the island with smallpox on board.
Smallpox has today been eradicated in one of mankind's greatest public health triumphs. However, for much of human history, it was the deadliest, the most contagious, and the most widely feared disease.
The patients were to be brought ashore if possible at once. Bessie went up to the hospital ready, and the boys went off with the ambulance to bring the patients ashore. Bessie expected to have to nurse, and we were rather frightened about it. The storm raged all afternoon. It was too bad for a sick person to land.
The fear was not only of getting sick, but also of quarantine. If there was an outbreak of smallpox on the island, nobody would be allowed to leave.
I was glad I had got a new hymn book. If we were all to be quarantined, there would be time for singing. My poor older brother Jack was rather scared at the idea of smallpox.
After the sick immigrants were finally unloaded from the ship, Nellie wrote about the next steps for the workers on Partridge Island.
Everyone is kept busy all the time, as the clothes all have to be disinfected, and the men have to bring all the provisions down, pump water, and carry coal. Father has to attend the hospital.
The sick passengers on the ship, the SS Alcides, were coming from Scotland.
The men are all Scotchmen and a lively lot. One of them asked Fred one night how he got along in his courting. I have kept it up ever since.
And perhaps a sign that younger siblings have not changed at all since 1902. Nellie decided to play a prank on the man she suspected to be her older sister's secret boyfriend. To do so, she enlisted the help of a nurse named Gertie, who was headed over to St. John.
I arranged with Gertie to send down a postcard on St. Valentine's Day with a picture of the suspension bridge on it, and sure enough, it came in good time for Fred's surprise. He was puzzled at first, but soon suspected a trick.
Partridge Island had been used as a quarantine site for sick immigrants ever since the Loyalists first arrived, way back in 1783. The island is perhaps best known, or most infamous, I should say, for an extraordinarily dark time that happened half a century before Nellie and McGowan was there. In 1847, thousands of desperate, hungry, and sick Irish immigrants were quarantined while fleeing the Irish potato famine. At that point, there was only one little hospital with 100 beds on Partridge Island, and the Irish, as a result, were left with inadequate food, clothing, and tents. According to St. John historian Harold Wright, who discovered and compiled Nellie McGowan's diary, there are an estimated 1,000 people who died on Partridge Island that are still buried there, and the vast majority of them died in 1847. The 1847 events sparked all of this acrimony and investigations, and Partridge Island Quarantine Station was shut down. They were skipping ahead 40 years from that dark time to Nellie McGowan's time. A new wave of immigrants were coming to Canada, so the Partridge Island Quarantine Station was reopened. But lessons were learned from the earlier disaster. This time around, when Nellie McGowan lived there, the quarantine station was, relatively speaking, well-funded, well-staffed, and well-equipped. This resulted in drastically different outcomes for the people who were quarantined. For example, Nellie McGowan wrote that all of the patients on that Scottish ship recovered.
It was fortunate that no more cases developed. The crew were released, and that evening, Bessie and I went to the doctor's house and found them preparing a supper in honor of the officers and the captain. We heard all the songs and speeches. I hadn't heard such broad Scotch before. Bessie was delighted.
That March, a ship arrived from Ireland, and it was quarantined with even more sick patients.
The sick men were very sick indeed, and needed much watching.
Meanwhile, she continued her investigation.
Bessie's birthday was on March 14th and passed without much celebration because we were so busy. But I made a nut cake with all the ring, button, thimble, and scent celebration.
Those items Nellie mentioned were cooked into a cake that was baked by Nellie. The person eating the cake was supposed to hope to get a ring or a button or a thimble or a coin in the piece of cake because it was considered a sign of good luck in the coming year. Well, some of them were good luck. Some of them were actually also really bad luck, especially something you'd get in a birthday cake. So the ring, getting a ring in your piece of cake, meant that the person who found it in their cake would be the next to get married. The thimble was the opposite though. If you got a thimble in your cake, it meant that the person would never get married and would become, using the language of the time, an old maid. Getting a button in your cake is a sign of good luck, but getting a penny is a sign of poverty. So you've got like a 50-50 chance of a sign of good fortune and a 50-50 chance of a sign of disaster from eating your birthday cake. According to Nellie McGowan,
Fred got the button and Bessie a cent, a sure sign that they will be married.
3 days after this was St. Patrick's Day.
On the 17th of March, I managed to pin a leaf of shamrock on Fred and Jack's caps without them knowing. They were the envy of all the Irishmen on the steamer. The first mate said he would give anything for a bit of shamrock to wear, so at dinner time, I took one of my pots of shamrock and sent it over to the officers. They were more than delighted.
Despite all the modern medical advances of 1902 being available on Partridge Island, some of the immigrants did die while in quarantine. Of the 1,600 Irish immigrants who were quarantined on the island that St. Patrick's Day, one passed away. Nellie wrote in her diary,
"It is many, many years since the like has taken place, and the saddest part is that the poor fellow's friends may never know of it. Down on the east side by the sea the grave is, and far away his mother, or perhaps his wife for all we know, may wonder why he never came back again."
That April, more ships arrived, carrying more sick immigrants. Although Nellie didn't generally bother to get to know the patients, since, after all, they would be leaving when they get better in a few weeks, or if things went really badly, they would die. She did make an exception for one girl who was a patient who was her own age.
One scarlet fever patient was a Swedish girl named Emma who knew nothing of English at all, nor could the other patients speak her language. The Swedish girl named Emma made a good recovery and was a very bright, clever young woman, and rather good-looking too. She had lots of fun and was so smart about making herself understood.
Much to Nellie's delight, despite the language barrier, Emma also picked up that there was something going on between Fred and Bessie.
She soon learned to tease Bessie and Fred.
Despite her suspicions being agreed on by the Swedish Emma, Nellie wrote that
Bessie denies everything and scoffs at the suggestion. She's very indignant. Another proof, I think.
After Emma recovered, before she ended up leaving Partridge Island, she accompanied Bessie on a trip into St. John.
On Monday, Bessie was free and Emma came with her. She was so pleased to get away and seemed so well and happy as a child.
Fred, who Nellie repeatedly makes fun of for his superstitiousness, also goes to St. John with them. He was adamant that he talk to a fortune teller before making an upcoming major life choice. Not long after, Nellie wrote,
"It must have been sometime in the following week that Bessie became engaged to Fred.
If she sounds distracted after spending the better part of a year trying to decipher this mystery, it was because she was. Late that summer, her father had contracted smallpox.
It is the first case for St. John, and there has been quite a scare about it. Father suffers a good deal of pain."
While Nellie generally avoids writing about the details of her father's condition, it becomes clear in her diary that his health is deteriorating when her sibling moves up their wedding date. On August 6th, the family departed Partridge Island to go to the wedding, which was taking place in St. John.
Mother looks nice in her new dress, which fits perfectly. A wedding is especially sad now. Father is very poorly indeed. I could not help but wonder if he would ever be able to go to town again. He was so pale and sick looking. He congratulated and kissed his daughter. Then almost immediately after the ceremony, he called for Sam McGowan, who rode him back to the island.
During the wedding festivities, Nellie got to ride in a carriage for the first time, which she wrote excitedly about. She stayed in town for a full week afterwards. During her time in St. John, she went to the exhibition several times, where a particular highlight for her was a big fireworks show. But afterwards, she wrote,
"I left town feeling rather better, but I got a shock when I arrived home, for Father had a very weak spell. Bessie phoned for the boys."
For the next 3 weeks, Nellie's father, Thomas McGowan, grew weaker. extended McGowan family members began to arrive on Partridge Island.
There were 17 of us in the home. We read the Bible and prayed. How thin and weak Father looked, and poor little Phyllis wondered why Grandpa didn't get anything to eat. It is so strange to think Father has made his last trip from the island, never to return. Poor Father. He liked the fresh cold water, and the last day, he said he would like to lie near the well and drink all the time. The lamp was lighted. How thankful we are that he was on the island till the last.
Thomas McGowan had been the lighthouse keeper of Partridge Island, and now that he had passed away, the family were given 1 month to leave the island and move to St. John. Not all of the family, though, because the recently married Bessie and Fred decided to stay behind on the island for work. So this, for the first time, broke up this large family. As the autumn of 1902 grew colder and the nights grew darker as November turned into December, Nellie's diary paints a picture of a young woman struggling to adapt to her new life away from her beloved island home. In St. John, she avoided going to her new church for several weeks. When she finally did show up, she was startled to see that the congregation had tried to welcome her by all dressing up in black in honor of her father. She was furious at this, writing in her diary,
I can't help disliking them when it is my own grief.
She found herself becoming easily angered in general.
The papers have so much to say in criticism of everything that I get angry reading them.
The source of this was likely a new source of grief. Bessie and Fred announced that they were planning on moving out west for work.
It's so provoking to hear.
That December, Nellie began taking long walks alone through St. John on the cold nights.
I walked around and thoroughly enjoyed myself. The moonlit nights are so lovely. I was so homesick.
Her favorite destination to walk was the suspension bridge. 1 year after she began her diary, Nellie McGowan wrote her last entry. Nothing bad happened to her, she just stopped writing. It seemed that she'd simply kept a diary for exactly 1 year as a New Year's resolution. That little black diary, which had a picture of Father Time on the front, offers us an extraordinary personal look into the life of an ordinary person more than 1 century ago. Her final entry, even after all she faced, the last thing she wrote in her diary ended on this note of optimism, where she hoped for a better new year.
I have just come home from watching night service at church and heard Nearer My Home to Thee sung again. The meeting was very solemn and sad. I wonder how poor Bessie is on the island tonight. What a difference since last year, and how little any of us thought of what has come to pass since. May we all be led to safety in the coming year.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.